Good morning, and welcome to part 14 of our study of the book of Ecclesiastes. It says in 1 Timothy 6, verse 10, "For the love of money is the root of all evil." Now Solomon was considered to be the richest man who ever lived, and therefore it's not surprising that he spent some of this book reminiscing and talking about finances and money. He knew what money could do for you. He also knew what money could do to you. And therefore, in the last part of the last chapter, he listed 5 things about one's love of money, 5 problems. He said the more we have, the more we want. People spend their lifetime accumulating more and more and more wealth, even though it's far in excess of what they could ever themselves use. He said the more we have, the more we spend, the more we give out in our expenses for the toys and for the buildings and for the extravagances that we have. Therefore, the more we need, because the more we spend. The more we have, the more we worry. People worry about their money. They worry about having enough. They worry about losing it. They worry about someone stealing it. The more we have, the more we worry. The more we have, the more we lose. And then the more we have, the more we leave behind. So this was the end of chapter 5, essentially, except for 2 more pieces of knowledge. One was, he said that God gives us the ability to make our finances, to make our money. He gives us the talents, he gives us the training, he gives us the intellect, he gives us the wisdom. Whatever we do, he gives it to us. So he gives us the ability to earn money. But he also gives us the ability to enjoy the money, to use the money in the right way for the good of ourselves and for the good of others. And this is what he says. He gives us the ability to enjoy the money that we earn. So now in chapter 6, he goes back again to talk about people who have an excessive wealth, but no God. And he says this in the first verse of chapter 6, "There is an evil which I have seen under the sun, and it is common among men." So this is not an uncommon problem for people to have a greater wealth than they need. And the discrepancy between the poor and the rich was even probably greater in the times of Solomon, where there were no social interventions by the government, where people had to earn their keep. So people either had vast amounts of wealth or had probably none at all. And he says he has seen this evil, which I have seen under the sun, and it is common among men. A man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor, so that he lacks nothing for himself. Now notice God does not say a love of God in there, whom God has given a respect of goodness or a respect for God. He said who God has given riches and wealth and honor, so that he lacks nothing for himself of all he desires. Solomon was certainly in that category. He built buildings, he had many, many extravagances, he had many wives, he had much wealth. He certainly fit in that category. Of all that he desires, yet God does not give him power to eat of it, but a foreigner consumes it. This is vanity, and it is an evil affliction. Now, in the last part of the previous chapter, he said this: God has given riches and wealth, and given him power to eat of it. So what he is saying here is not literally consume it like you do food, although that can be part of it too. What he's saying is that he has given him the ability to make money, to obtain wealth, to obtain riches, to obtain honor, but has not given him the ability, or a man does not have the sense to consume it properly for his good and for the goodness of others. It keeps accumulating, and man does not. therefore consume it or eat of it. Now that does not literally mean food, although in some cases that's the extent. There have been people in this area who have literally almost starved themselves to death because they would not obtain food, even though their bank accounts have thousands of dollars in them. There are people who go cold in the winter because they can't get fuel or don't get fuel, even though they can well afford it. And this is the idea that people have this money, they have this wealth, and they don't use it for their own good or for the good of others. They just accumulate it and keep it. The picture that comes to mind is that of Scrooge in the movie A Christmas Carol, sitting at his desk with one candle burning, one cold piece of coal in the fire, cold, poring over his books on Christmas Eve. Everybody else is out sort of greeting each other and being cheerful, and he's there just poring over his books, too miserly to even spend money on himself or others. This is the picture one gets of these type of people. And it is not unusual. I mentioned in the last lesson about John D. Rockefeller, a man who in his 50s became the world's first billionaire and who was making $1 million a week. And yet he was so miserable in worrying about his money that he had to survive practically on crackers and milk. And it was only after he started giving it away, started being more generous with it, started using it properly, that his health recovered, and he lived to be 98. But this is the idea that Solomon is giving of these people who hoard their money, their wealth, afraid to spend it, afraid to use it properly, and afraid to give any goodness. Then he says, if a man begets 100 children and lives many years, so that the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with goodness, or indeed he has no burial. In the days of Solomon, there were three aspects particularly which meant that God blessed you. It was if the patriarch had a long life, if he had many children, and if he had a decent burial. And not being buried was considered a total lack of disrespect on the part of his relatives and his friends and his peers. It says in Jeremiah chapter 22 about Jehoiakim the king, who was not buried with respect because his people did not have any respect for him. So these are three things that were important in the life of the Jewish people: to have a long life, to have children, and to have a decent burial. And this is what he's saying here. If a man begets 100 children and lives many years, but his soul is not satisfied with goodness, in other words, if he has not done with his wealth what was required or what was needed or what was prudent, then he has no burial. He is not going to be respected by his peers and by his people. And that he says, I say that a stillborn child is better than he, for it comes in vanity and departs in darkness, and its name is covered with darkness. Though it has not seen the sun or known anything, this has more rest than that man. Even if he lives 1,000 years twice, but has not seen goodness. Do not all go to one place. A stillborn child has more rest, has more peace than a man who lives for 1,000 or 2,000 years and has no goodness in his heart. It says in Job 3, verse 16, or why was I not hidden like a stillborn child, like infants who never saw light? When he refers to his own problems and his own desperation at the time when God was testing him. See, it says in Psalm 73:7, men, their eyes bulge with abundance. They have more than their heart could ever wish for. This describes these people that Solomon is referring to, people who have an abundance of wealth, of material possessions, an abundance of almost everything one's heart could desire, but no goodness, no ability to help others, no ability to really help themselves. And like John D. Rockefeller, when he was hoarding his money, when he was a young man of 50, he was so miserable he lived primarily on crackers and milk. It was when he became more generous and more knowledgeable about his use of his money properly that his health improved. Another example that's given, and these examples are taken from Jeremiah's book, Searching for Heaven on Earth. He also talks about another man by the name of J.C. Penney. J.C. Penney was an entrepreneur, quite a businessman. He built a flourishing business, but yet he became filled with despair. And it says that he checked himself into a hospital and waited to die. No doctor could do a thing for him. And it says once the certainty of impending death flooded across Penney's troubled soul. He was writing himself notes, writing farewell notes to his wife and his loved ones when he heard the singing of nurses in a chapel down the hall. No matter what may be the test, they sang, God will take care of you. Penney heard these words, and apparently they were the voices which made a difference in his life. It says something was suddenly born within his soul, an assurance that the old faith was true, and he was completely in the loving hands of Jesus and need for no more. It says J.C. Penney checked himself out of his bed immediately. He was cured. It was a brand new creation. He left the hospital, rebuilt his sagging business empire to unprecedented heights, and served God magnificently all his days. You see, no matter what you have, without God, it is really meaningless. It is really without any. It's really vanity overall. So, the idea is that you're serving a God, regardless of whether you're serving God himself or whether you're serving the God of money. It says in Matthew chapter 6, verse 16, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Verse 24, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. The idea is, and Solomon is saying it very bluntly, no matter how long you live, no matter how much you have, whether you have children, whether you have wealth, whether you have fame, whether you have honor, if you have any of this without God, it ends up being meaningless. For in the end, the child that is born and stillborn, the child that never sees the light of day, and the person who lives hundreds of years with all the wealth in the world, both end up in the same place, dust to dust in the end. It's only if you have God that the difference is made. And Solomon has more to say about wealth and money in the next part of this chapter, but we'll get onto that next week. So that's enough for today. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.